No. So we open up for questions. So raise your hands. Let's start here.
Yeah. I'm a teacher. I'm in the NEUT section. So one of the things I want to talk about is the number of unaccompanied children who are in refugee camps. I've just checked it again. There are 95,000 unaccompanied children refugees in refugee camps in Europe today, right now. And we know in 2016 the government said that they take 350,000 of those refugees. In actual fact, they never did it. When I heard that news, I went to my local authority and I said, how are we going to welcome refugees in Barking and Dagenham? And my local authority said, calm down, we're having a meeting, we're making plans for this, because we expect to be asked to take unaccompanied refugees in, and we're going to make a plan. In fact, we were never asked as Barking and Dagenham to take any of those, because the 350,000 who were allowed in were already here. Actually, they were already here, and I can tell you that because it's in the council papers. That's why we were never asked. We were told it's not needed. Don't worry about your plans to welcome refugees into Barking and Dagenham. You don't need to. Not one refugee entered our schools. We have 59 schools. I checked every single one of them. Not one of them took a refugee, an unaccompanied child refugee. So all of our plans were not needed in actual fact, because it was a bloody lie, and we know it. It was a piddly number to start with, and it was a bloody lie. So one of the things that I'm actually quite keen to have raised in my union is about what we do about that. We have trips over to Calais. We go over to Calais every half term. We collect a vast amount of stuff, exactly what we're asked to take, and we go over. We open to school there, and I think that, that's fine. But I think we need to look at it as trade unionists, we need to look at it on a bigger issue and start demanding bigger things, really. The other thing is about trade unionists, just very quickly, trade unionists and refugees. My mother entered this country as an unaccompanied child refugee from Malta, actually, by way of Egypt. These things happen in war. She came after the Second World War. She arrived with her sisters, completely unaccompanied, and ended up in a refugee centre in Leeds, which was run by the National Union of Mine Workers, for which my father was a member. Now, if miners live in small villages outside the main town centres, so he'd never seen anyone of colour. He told me, I've never seen anyone before. I went to that refugee centre, but actually he was an internationalist, even though he'd never left the village. He was an internationalist. He'd only ever worked in the pit, he'd only ever lived in the village, but as a trade unionist, he'd listened to people, he'd followed the trade union movement, and he was an internationalist, and he knew it was his duty, actually, to help fellow workers. And that's what he said to me. Why would I not help fellow workers? And it's a part of his humanity that I've taken with me, and that actually I've always taken with me, that actually as trade unionists, fundamentally, we are internationalists, we are humanitarians. And I think that's important as well, to have those arguments with people. It's very, very basic arguments, because they're not easy to have with trade unionists. You have to have really hard arguments with them, because they carry a lot of ideas in their head that don't suit.
Thank you very much. I take, if we can have quick questions and contributions, because again we are running a little bit out of time. So I take 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, let's go.
Just wanted to continue referring to the point that you made about Yarlswood, because I think that's a really important question. And we may not have, as in Italy, the fascists sort of like waiting in the wings as a prospective government, but we've got a government at present who have, declared that they want to create an environment very, very hostile to migrants, and of course the conditions faced. I mean, there's a hunger strike at present in Yarlswood of 150 women who are facing indefinite detention. This is the only country, I believe, in Europe where migrants do face indefinite detention. And this will be very, very difficult, I think, for a Labour government to deal with. Because it was a Labour government, actually, that created Yarlswood in the first place under Tony Blair. And it was very good to actually see Diane Abbott going there last week and showing solidarity with those women. But I already detect, certain equivocation within, the Labour opposition over this issue, and equivocation can actually change into, backsliding over issues such as the immigration detention centres, because I don't think it's enough to actually end indefinite detention. These places are inhumane and should be closed down completely. It just brings us to the point there have been leaflets going around about the UN anti-racism demonstration on March the 17th, and I think it's absolutely important that, as that we support those sorts of demonstrations and put that sort of pressure on from below, to raise the issue of the political racism created by this government, which is then giving encouragement, as Trump is in the States, to all sorts of nasty elements such as Britain First and national action and so on.
Thank you very much. Your time.
My name's Anna. I'm an environmental activist. I work with an arts organisation called Invisible Dust, who work with climate change and the arts. And I want to thank you both for your speaking so transparently. It's such a relief to speak transparently about race and racism and climate change. And I suppose my question is, trying to bring it together in an articulate way, but I guess I wanted to pick up on what Barry said in that room about how we're all talking to each other, and I want to just, there is no ourselves in that room or even in this room, and the fact is that the biggest audience applause came when that woman stood up and said we have to stop fracking in England forever, and at the end of the day, people in this room and in that room care most, first and foremost, about stopping fracking here on their own doorsteps for themselves in their own communities, and it's not okay. It's not okay to have most of the country thinking that colonialism was going abroad and giving people a British passport and the church. It's not okay that people don't understand that they invited people from many parts of the world to come and fix Britain's economic situation. It's not okay that they have people in the global south have a right to be here because we have removed their right and their ability to exist in their own places. Obviously they'd rather be here. Who would rather be here? No one wants to be here. I consistently am talking to my friends about when I'm going to move home. Nobody, it's cold, it's grey, it's grumpy, it's expensive, and it's hella racist. And that's a shitty way to move around the world. And partly I have to live in this place because I'm queer and because Britain has ruined my country's understanding that queerness is already an African understanding of self. So there are many, many layers in which Britain and Europe has consistently destroyed our ability to exist at home. And so my question is, obviously, there is no definition anyway between war migrants, economic migrants, and climate migrants, because climate change causes war, ruins economies, and a climate migrant is like the third equation of what you've got, right? So I guess my question is, here talking amongst ourselves, how in this room, at this conference, in this conversation, the priorities are changed, and the conversation isn't, oh yes, we need to go and help those brown people, but is that, it's not just something that we should do, it's our responsibility. It should be the first thing we think about when we wake up in the morning. It's not about whether or not my kid will be able to walk to school, which is why I constantly hear, is that, well, my kid won't be able to walk to school because of the pollution on the streets. And that's not, as long as that's your priority and you don't understand that your kid being able to walk to school because of pollution on the streets is the same as that kid can't even go to school because of so many things, and the pollution is the last thing on that parent's mind, until those priorities are aligned and you're not you/we, because you're absolutely right, we are also the we, regardless of being brown and being diaspora in this country. Until that is not our priority and we're not on the same level, I don't feel like this conversation of climate migrants and economic migrants and war migrants is helpful. Or even if those are rights that need to be protected, it's not a solution.
Thank you very much. So we go from the back, yeah? Thank you.
Right. My name's John Devine. I'm again in the National Education Unity section. I think, relating to something Rolf was talking about, the policy changes that Blair brought in about constricted immigration, as he saw it, actually have a long history. It's not just New Labour, Old Labour. When you go back to the Second World War and look at what happened in Britain after the war, and the constraints that were brought in to prevent, say, Jewish people from Europe coming into Britain, were part and parcel of that. But the main point I'd like to ask is, how do you get a consensus around what legal protection there should be for climate migrants? What's the role of the trade union movement in doing that? How do we bring it about?
I collect all the questions at this point, so next, exactly.
Two things I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that were mentioned by the speakers. This whole idea about a hostile environment. This has very critical implications. There's been a whole lot of stuff in the Guardian recently about Commonwealth citizens who've been told that because they can't prove, because they came here as children, they can't prove the documentation. I'm just looking at a story about a guy whose name is being withheld for legal reasons, who's not being offered chemotherapy for his cancer, despite the fact he's been here for 44 years, worked for most of that time, paid taxes. Because he came as a child, his mother came here to work in the NHS, he's being told he's not going to be able to get his prostate cancer treated unless he can come up with £54,000 up front to pay for it. That is a hostile environment for refugees, migrants, whatever the reason why they're here. If you look at the borough I live, Haringey, there is a Home Office person seconded into Haringey Council, and there's some confusion about the numbers, but an £83,000 paid by Haringey Council to the Home Office to second an immigration officer into the social services team that deals with people with no recourse to public funds. These are the most desperate, vulnerable people who are looking for Section 17 money to feed their children. That's what we mean by hostile environment. So we're going to tackle the question of refugees, migrants. It starts, as I said, it starts with the issues at home. How do we challenge the practices that are taking place right now, up and down this country, leaving people to die with prostate cancer, trying to scare people off going to claim money to feed their children? Those are the acid tests, and this is a real political question that we have to take up. The last thing I want to say, because I'm no short on time, is I'm here for the Stamps Retum. I run the Stamps Retum store. We are very happy that we've got the climate change conference here, the trade union group, to agree to have a climate change block on the demonstration. Because I think the scaremongering about refugee crisis and migration crisis is nothing compared to what's going to happen with the way climate change is going on. There's going to be movements of people that we haven't seen for thousands and thousands of years. This is what we're going to have to confront. We've got to tie the economic question to power, the corporate way things are, production is made. Just a last example on this. As I talked about South Asia, Africa, look at the Mekong Delta, look at the Mekong River. Mass deforestation in Laos, in Cambodia, means the Mekong River is getting down to inches. This is the lifeblood of that whole area. This is commercial timber foresting in Alaska, where it's destroying that whole climate. Where are those people going to go when there's no water to grow their crops? There's no water to grow their food. They're going to want to move somewhere. So the economic, the political, and the hostility to this idea of having a hostile environment are all things we need to link together and challenge, and that's why I think it's great there's going to be a climate change block on the demonstration. I would urge everybody to come along to it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So very quick questions. Yes.
I'm Lina, I'm a master's student in London. I have a question about your thoughts on the role of the EU regarding climate refugees. And so, since nothing is biting internationally, what do you think could be done and could be more decisive coming from the EU, legally maybe, and maybe if you have time, your thoughts on planned relocation regarding climate migrants and climate adaptation.
On the other table, yeah, then I come here.
Well, yeah, like a comment from Barkin, I've been to Calais a lot to see the refugee camp there, to meet the refugees. The thing that really strikes you is how arbitrary and ridiculous borders are. I went with a guy from Brixton Hill Moss. He works in Domino's. He told his co-worker in Domino's that he was going to Calais, and his co-worker said, "My brother's out in Calais. They're from Eritrea. This guy's lived here for 16 years. His brother is being left to rot really in Calais. Why? Because he has a piece of paper and his brother doesn't. And it just shows you the ridiculous nature of this sort of border regime. But I just wanted to also touch on what Assad said about the rise of racism and fascism in Europe. Because he mentioned Italy. Also, I think we've got to look at France as well, where Marine Le Pen might be the next president of France. It's a terrifying thought, but it might be the case. And I think there's big lessons for us, because sometimes you hear the argument in the trade union movement that if you fight austerity, then you don't need to worry about the racism argument. If you fight about wages, then you don't need to take on issues about migrants, refugees and so on. France is a warning for us. In France, they have the biggest left in Europe, the biggest black population in Europe, and the biggest Muslim population in Europe. But how is it that the Front National can be on 26% on the vote? It's because they don't have an anti-racist movement. They have big unions, they have a big left, but they don't have an anti-racist movement which argues for a movement against racism from below. So I think that's a big lesson for us. I think we have to try and build that movement. That's why it's fantastic that we're having this workshop here today, so that the climate movement, the anti-austerity movement can unite and be part of that.
So why haven't
Thank you.
we built it?
One second. I'm sorry,
Why haven't we built it, mate? You know what I mean?
I'm
That's the
sorry,
big
Well,
question.
we have one last question.
Yeah, I want to I'm Andrea and I've done loads of stuff, but most recently to do with Occupy. Before that though, I did drug policy reform, and I just want to, because I actually disagree with some of what's been said in this room today. We had to, on account of trying to save lives from AIDS, from overdose and so on and so on, be A, cognizant of who we were talking to, if we were going to get a result, and B, recognise that actually people are bloody selfish. When our leading reformer in the States, who happened to be a rabbi's son, started saying, it's your tax dollars that are killing people in the global drug war, people started to respond, and things have moved forward now. So all these people that have, become fat cats in cannabis reform are being pressured by us to put money into failing schools, failing hospitals, blah, 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 because that welfare state doesn't really exist, right? So I feel, as I've always tried to be, in my trainings, is that we have to address people according to who they are, not because our goal is to get people on board. That's it. We have to tell them that it is morally wrong to let people drown in the fucking Pacific and the Mediterranean and everywhere else. So whatever it takes is what we need to do. So, I must be getting old, because I think what I heard was that younger people talking very idealistically, and I think it is necessary and it's important what you're saying, but I also think, humans are bloody selfish.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would say if you can answer and make conclusions, each of you in 5 minutes, and eventually also, how can I say, paving the way forward, so how we can combine all these arguments and all these reflections and see a way forward in the campaign. Thank you very much. Do you want to start first? Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of interesting questions being raised. I think the point you make about self-interest and how you get people to think about this is important. I've always seen trade unionism as collective self-interest, and actually, one of the things I always think about the debates around climate change, whether it's about migration or anything, refugees about anything. It's rather unfortunate that we talk about it in relation to climate. Because I always remember one of the things that Assad said, that I heard him say many years ago, the biggest mistake the environmental movement ever made was to put a picture of a polar bear up. Right. Because ultimately, it's not about polar bears, it's not about storms, it's not about droughts, it's about us, and it's about human activity. And central to that is about exploitation. And I think that's the core of the point that we've got to get across to people. That actually inequality is as a result of exploitation of people, exploitation of resources, and exploitation of the planet. And that is something that as trade unionists, people should understand, and we need to politicise people around that. So that it's not just about what's happening to them in their workplace. I always, I came into the trade union movement believing that actually trade unionism was about improving people's lives, not about improving people's working lives, because actually that's only part of the equation. And somehow or other, I think we've lost that. That actually we have a very narrow definition of what trade unionism is about. Therefore, we have a very narrow conversation with people about what it is we need to do. And one of the things we need to do is start, dealing with some of the issues that our government are up to, and that we have to start at home, really. First comment, you talked about the children in Calais. The point about the children in Calais and unaccompanied children across Europe, for me, is that actually we have to start thinking in terms of the trade union movement, is that how do we start getting accountability from our government for the laws that actually are there, right? Because the thing about Calais, and especially in relation to the Dobbs Amendment that got passed in relation to unaccompanied children, is the way that the government flouted the law, both the domestic law and international law, in relation to the situation of unaccompanied minors. The same can be said absolutely for what's happening in Yarswood and detention centres. I mean, we need to be campaigning to get rid of detention centres. But in terms of what is happening in Yarswood and what's happening in terms of Yarswood, not just as a detention centre, but we always think of it as a way of making money for the private sector, right, is the absolute flouting of British and international law in relation to people that are there. So if we can't even build campaigns to actually hold our government for accounts that the laws that are already there, and I think the trade union movement has a key role to play in that, because actually it's about saying, well, is the government for business or are they for the people? Right? I mean, that's central political question that we have to face up our members with and start talking about in relation to all of these issues. What is the government there to do? Is it there to facilitate things for business, or is it there to deal with the problems that society has in general? And somehow or other, I think we're letting them off the hook. I mean, I think the reason we don't have a problem with a Front National or a Northern League or an APD in the UK is, quite frankly, because we don't need one, because we've got an authoritarian government in power that's as right-wing and as fascist as any of those in terms of their underlying political philosophy. So we don't need, that's why UKIP has never really managed to make political purchase. That's why the National Front didn't in the 1980s, because actually, our government, and one of the, and I wouldn't say it's just that, I wouldn't say it in relation to our government, but one of the things about neoliberalism as a political philosophy is it is incredibly authoritarian. So actually, if we are going to do anything about these things, we have to tackle that, because for me, governance is at the centre of this. It's that actually we can put You know, we can have a debate about what laws there should be about climate refugees. We can get a protocol, we can get the European Union, you know, perhaps to start talking about, you know, what their policy should be. But ultimately, if you have rules in place, and what governments do, because actually what the role they play is to facilitate business, is to completely ignore those rules, then that becomes meaningless. And the very last thing I'll say in relation to this is that we have to understand, and we have to get trade union members to understand, is that what they do to the most vulnerable, they eventually do to everybody else.
Yep.
Right? And that's the central question, you know, that's the essential thing that people have got to understand. That what they do to refugees, it isn't just about refugees. It has a fundamental, you know, it's always the thin end of the wedge. And the one example I'll give it is in relation to the rule of law and rights in this country, which is that we used to have a legal system which was based on the idea that everybody could get access to it, right? Irrespective of their ability to pay. Yeah? The idea that you had to start paying for legal services came in relation to refugee policy, when they suddenly started saying, well, refugees should have to pay for their rights to appeal, right? And if you undermine the basis of legal principle in one area, then eventually it creeps into all other things, you know. And eventually, although it's been rolled back for a while, but not forever, you know, it's had an impact on legal aid, right? It's had an impact on, it had a direct impact for trade unions when government introduced tribunal fees, you know. So we have to say to people, this isn't just about them being horrible to this group of people who you're not sympathetic about. Actually, what they're doing to them today, they'll be doing to you tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Arthur?
Okay, I'll start by just saying I think the one reality we all have to accept is that you know, we particularly around migrant and refugee issues, we lack power, right? Our movements aren't strong enough, right? That's why, for all the amazing stuff that we're still able to do, and it's not just here in terms of the UK but across Europe, you know, solidarity stuff, whether it's Calais, the refugee camps, blah 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 blah, in Germany, etc. And there's amazing stuff that people are trying to do, and in materially trying to make what solidarity looks like, is we're still not able to win the bigger political fight, right? Which is being able to change the centre of where the debate around migration and refugees is. And that's partly, to go to your point, is why I think climate refugees helps us in that, right? Because first of all, you know, when we talk about, and I talk a lot about, you know, the importance of when we're decolonising the movement and what that actually means, right? And it means basically radically altering the environment movement as to how it sees these things, right? So yes, it fights locally, but it also understands that fight in a global context, right? So, so you know, I absolutely understand, you know, why, particularly in terms of resistance in the UK, that the fight is around fracking, absolutely. And it's great now that many of those fracking communities, and I have to say, have done this, where they started off by saying, it's about my local water and my local air, to, it's now about climate change, to, actually I'm also in solidarity with people in Argentina opposing fracking. I'm also in solidarity with people, etc. Because we know that only through struggle people get politicised. And if that's the way that we begin to bring those real questions of power, who is it? Because fracking actually has done that, right? Local democracy overruled by central government in the interests of fracking companies. Despite everything that people did, they went to the local councils, the county councils, went to courts. Time and time again, the government says, no, we're going to be doing this, and overrides and local people. And that, I think, is really a politicising moment. So that's partly why I think I'm not too fussed that people care about fracking. I'm glad that actually there's some resistance for a change around something to do with climate change, because it begins to give us the opening to have a much bigger conversation. And that bigger conversation, of course, is linked to this thing about we need a new internationalism, right? So when people talk about, you know, I mean, way back in your parents' generation, of people instinctively feeling that they were internationalists and knowing what solidarity meant at a very human level and at a political level, or whether we talk about even in the worst, darkest moments of Thatcher, that people still understood that internationalism meant that we fought about South Africa and Nicaragua and what it meant. And there's been this sort of falling away of internationalism, right? Even at the most moment of the progressive left, and I think this is not just about the UK, but it's also happened right across the European left as well, where a lot of the European left have basically retrenched and said, we have to talk about domestic issues. Can't really talk about, we haven't got bandwidth now to talk about global issues. We can't connect global issues. We just have to, as I said, we have to fight the austerity fight because that's the local fight. And I think what we're trying to do is rebuild a new internationalism. And that's where the trade union movement is really, really important, because deep in the trade union movement, not just as a historic reality, but actually in the principles of it. The principle as a trade unionist of an injury to one is an injury to all. It has that internationalism, but it also has international structures. It has organised labour in the global north and in the global south. So it has a potential for people to be able to centre demands in a very, very different way than you are going to get in probably many other sort of, whether the broad mainstream environment movement. That's why I think the trade unions are so important in this migration, climate, refugee discussion, because they can do more than just in terms of workplace. And in many parts of the world, the trade unions do exactly that, right? It's only sometimes in the global north. In the global south, unions recognise that their members are their members, whether they're in the community, in a building that's called the workplace, or anywhere else, and that they understand the connection between their fight in the workspace as the fight in terms of political equality, etc. So that's why in that question about what's the trade union's role in getting the legal definition, frankly, you know, there's a lot of us doing the work on the legal definition, right? I don't really want the trade unions to get involved in trying to get involved in that. What we look for is that the trade unions to recognise that their role in this is, you know, doing that internationalism that way, but also deepening and moving their own members, because still, organised-wise, the labour movement is still one of the largest organised section of people in this country. And if we want to change narratives, and if we want to change the centre of where these debates are, the union movement is really, really important. And secondly, what the climate refugee thing does for us, I think, is, when we've always said, when you look back at any political struggle in this country, you say, you know, if you want to deconstruct, say, you know, what is the winning combination that you have, right, at any given point, mainly on any social justice issues, it's always the directly affected communities give you the energy, the passion, and centre it. The solidarity, which has always largely come from trade unions, young people, those always have been, and morally, faith organisations. If you can get them all on the same page, you can actually start to shift things. We did it on anti-apartheid, we did it, of course, historically on women's rights, we've done it historically in terms of even in the anti-imperialist struggles. There's been this kind of combinations of people coming together. And I think this is what Climate Refugees allows us to try and do. It tries to allow us to bring an alliance of people together. And in that, what it brings also is the environmentalists. And for me, the environmentalists, when I talk about the environmentalists, I talk about middle class, middle England. And it allows us to begin to have a conversation about those issues about equity and about internationalism, which we cannot, and we're not having those conversations. So I disagree with Barry Gardner about you need the Tories on board, right? Because because simply in any struggle you need 15% of population to back you. Those 15% come from that. They trigger another 20-25% of people, and most people don't give a shit, right? I mean, there's a bunch of people who don't give a shit, but if you can win over a large enough constituency of people, you can make transformational change, and we've always done that. And that's why, with limited resources, we should focus on actually building the building blocks. They're an add-on. At the moment, we don't even have the core ready, right? That's where I think we should be trying to do that. In terms of the role of the European Union legally and around planned relocation and adaptation, I can have a more detailed conversation with you in terms of after it. I think there's a, you know, look, there is a legal process that we've got an idea on in trying to get a legal definition in through the climate negotiations, because at least in the climate negotiations, every country is there. Every country is represented and they're represented equally. Civil society is there. There is this thing around loss and damage, the fourth pillar after, in terms of an adaptation, and there is spaces there to try and bring the argument that there needs to be legal protection. And that's what we're trying to do, because we'll be again in a race against time, because the arguments that are being put forward at the moment around legal protection are very, very narrow. In a weird way, usually stuff comes up by the movements, don't they? And it raises to a level, and then academia and legal people start to think about it and say, what would that codified look like? It's gone totally the wrong other way. If you look at where most debates around climate migration and refugees are, it's in academia and legal, it's not political. And we're trying to say, bring it back in terms of, because it's the political dimension, which is actually the most important dimension to make some of those legal options work. Because at the moment, the very narrow definition of what a climate refugee is, which is largely being put forward, or the much, much broader one. I'm going to just end in terms of saying about the UK hostile environment. And I think that's, again, why bringing the climate and the environmental movement into those spaces and forcing them. And they are forced because they're suddenly faced with a new kind of conversation around climate change, which they don't hear before, does get them to start saying, what does a hostile environment look like? And it allows us to do everything, not just about the UK government, but the fact that bloody a charity, St Mungo's, is acting as immigration officers. The fact that immigration officers are in our schools and our hospitals, etc. It's the hostile environment, where if you say to the environment movement at the moment, do that, they'll say, morally, we're with you, but we've got these other priorities, right? Because we have to fight the environmental. That's the refugee movement that does that. And that's the migrant movement that fights on this. And we've got to get a way in which we can leverage their resources, their power, their structures to fight on our ground. And climate migration, I think, is one of the ways in which we can begin to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
If anybody would like, in terms of War and Want, to be on our mailing list, please.
And we all come back at 2:30 for another round of